They found the bones fused together, slick with a film that should not have been wet anymore. The smell came first. Long before the sight, sweet, iron, heavy, like meat left too long in a closed room. When the cabin door was forced open, the cold air rushed in and carried the odor downhill, into the trees, into the lungs of everyone standing there. Inside, something had been burning, not wood, not coal, something softer, something that had once been alive. The floorboards were blackened beneath the bed. The mattress had collapsed inward, soaked through, as if the house itself had tried to swallow what happened there. In the corner, a bucket held rags stiff with dried blood. No one spoke. No one needed to. Whatever had lived in that room had screamed until it no longer could. This was the kind of place where stories didn't begin. They leaked. They oozed out of soil and timber decades later, when the people who knew the truth were already in the ground. Appalachia is full of such hollows, valleys pinched shut by mountains, where sunlight arrives late and leaves early, and names repeat across headstones like a stutter in stone. Places where the past does not stay behind you. It waits. The woman who slept in that bed had been young, barely old enough to know the weight of her own body, let alone the weight that grew inside it. She told the other women she could feel something wrong. Not kicks. Not the flutter they described with smiles and prayers. This was heavier, colder, as if what lived in her womb had already begun to forget how to be alive. They told her it was normal. They always did. In that hollow, bloodlines were not traced. They were assumed. Everyone belonged to everyone else in ways that were never spoken aloud, but were understood the same way rot is understood in wood. You don't need to see it to know it's there. Weddings were small, funerals were not, babies came often, and too many of them left wrapped in cloth before they were ever named. The night the screaming started, the dogs howled and would not stop. A neighbor later said the sound didn't come from the woman at all, but from the house itself, wood flexing and groaning as if under strain. Another claimed the creek ran dark by morning. No one wrote it down. No one needed to. Memory was enough. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because this story does not belong to one place alone. It belongs to every hour when the world is quiet enough for old things to surface. By dawn, the screaming had faded into a wet, rattling silence. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray. Inside that room, something had ended. But what died there did not stay there. It never does. In places like this, death has a way of lingering, of settling into the walls, of waiting for someone. Years later, to ask the wrong question and open the door again. The hollow did not appear on state maps until the late 1930s, and even then only as a thin pencil mark beside a creek without a name. Earlier survey charts from the 1800s showed the mountains but left the valley blank, as if the land itself had refused to be measured. Locals called it by an older word. One passed mouth to ear rather than ink to paper. Outsiders mispronounced it when they bothered to speak of it at all. Most never did. The first families arrived there after the Civil War, following a trail cut by timbermen and moonshiners, drawn by the promise of coal seams running black. And deep beneath the ridges, they built cabins from trees that had never known an axe, stacked logs with a care that suggested permanence, as if they believed this place would be the last they ever needed. Roads were promised. Schools were promised. Churches were promised. Most of those promises never climbed the mountain. By the turn of the century, the hollow had become inward, facing. The men worked the mines when there was work. When there wasn't, They trapped, hunted, and disappeared into the woods for days at a time. Women gave birth at home, assisted by sisters, aunts, cousins whose exact relation blurred with repetition. Last names echoed through the valley until they lost meaning. You learned who someone was not by asking how you were related, but by asking which cabin they slept in. County records from the early 1900s show strange omissions. Birth certificates filed months late, if at all. Deaths listed without causes. Entire households marked as non-responsive during census years, though smoke could be seen rising from their chimneys. A schoolhouse was built once, then quietly abandoned after the teacher left and did not return. Children learned what they needed to from whoever stayed alive long enough to teach them. Church services were held in a clapboard building with no foundation, resting directly on stone. Sermons focused heavily on obedience, on the dangers of the outside world, on blood as both burden and bond. The pastor, himself born in the hollow, rarely spoke of sin by name. He spoke instead of cycles, of inheritance, of punishment that traveled through generations like a sickness. By the 1950s, doctors had stopped visiting regularly. The road washed out each spring and was never properly repaired. Those who left for factory work in distant towns rarely came back, and when they did, they brought with them stories that made the hollow uneasy. Hospitals, tests, questions about family history. The hollow did not like questions. So life continued the way it always had. Marriages between people who shared grandparents, sometimes great-grandparents, sometimes more. Babies born small or wrong or not breathing at all. Burials carried out quickly, before anyone from outside could see too closely. The cemetery on the slope filled with short stones and wooden markers that weather erased faster than memory. By the time the young woman from the burned room was born, the hollow had already learned to live with loss. It had learned to fold grief inward, to call it fate, to call it God. What it had not learned, what it refused to learn, was when loss stopped being accidental and became something else entirely. And that refusal was already growing inside her long before she ever felt it move. She was born during a storm that peeled bark from trees and turned the creek into a brown, roaring vein. The women said the rain came too hard for a birth, that water like that meant something would be taken in exchange. But the labor began anyway, slow at first, then cruelly fast, the kind that leaves no time for prayers to finish forming in the mouth. The child arrived just before dawn. Silent, not stillborn, her chest moved, shallow and uneven. But she did not cry. Her skin held a grayish cast that lingered even after she was washed. The midwife lifted her, turned her slightly, and hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Long enough for the others to see the shape of her head, the way the bones had not settled as they should. Long enough for a look to pass between the women, wordless and heavy. They wrapped her quickly. The mother asked later why the room had gone so quiet. Someone told her the storm had passed. Someone else said the baby was sleeping. She was named after a grandmother who had died young. That alone should have been a warning. In the hollow, names were recycled the way clothes were, passed down, worn thin, stained with what came before. To carry a dead woman's name was to carry her ending with you, whether anyone admitted it or not. As the child grew, it became clear she was not like the others. She did not crawl when expected. When she finally stood, her balance wavered as if the ground beneath her shifted when no one else felt it. Her eyes tracked things that were not there, lingering on corners of rooms, on empty doorways, on the dark beneath the bed. She rarely spoke, and when she did, Her words came out oddly arranged, as though she were repeating phrases she had overheard rather than forming her own. At night she woke screaming. Not the sharp cries of a frightened child, but long, guttural sounds that rose and fell like mourning. The dogs would answer from outside, and sometimes the adults swore they heard a second voice tangled with hers, lower, closer to the floor. Drawings began to appear on scraps of paper and the backs of old bills. Crude figures clustered together, bodies overlapping, limbs indistinct, faces repeated again and again, the same eyes, the same mouths, copied until the page tore. One picture showed a woman split open at the center, something dark spilling out. When asked where she had seen that, the child said she hadn't seen it. She said she remembered it. Animals started turning up dead near the cabin. Chickens first, then a goat, no obvious wounds, just stillness, eyes clouded, bodies twisted as if they had seized and never let go. The adults blamed foxes, sickness, bad luck. They did not look at the child when they said it. By the time she was 6, people in the hollow had begun to avoid the cabin. They crossed themselves when they passed. They whispered that the girl carried something with her, something that had come from inside her mother and never fully left. And beneath those whispers lay a deeper unease. A sense that this child had not arrived alone, that whatever shaped her had been shaping the hollow for a very long time. As the years pressed forward, the hollow began to change around her, or perhaps it was only now that people noticed what had always been there. Nights grew louder, not with voices, but with sounds that resisted naming. Scraping along the underside of cabins, dull thuds from the woods, the sudden snap of branches where no one stood. The girl slept less. When she did, her body stiffened, jaw clenched so tight it bled at the corners. She woke knowing things she had never been told. She began to wander. At first, only short distances. Down to the creek, into the trees just beyond the clearing. She returned with mud on her hands, leaves tangled in her hair, smelling faintly of iron. Once, her mother followed at a distance and watched her kneel by the water, murmuring words that did not sound like prayer. The cadence was wrong. Too old. Too deliberate. When the mother stepped on a twig, the girl turned her head sharply, eyes fixing on her as if she had always known she was there. After that, she went farther. People found symbols carved into tree trunks, circles broken by lines, shapes that looked almost like family marks, but weren't. Stones were stacked along the creek bank in careful arrangements that no one admitted to building. The pastor spoke of temptation, of the devil finding purchase in weak places. But his sermons grew shorter, his voice thinner. He stopped visiting the cabin altogether. At night, lights appeared in the woods. Small, steady glows that did not move like lanterns. Children were forbidden from looking at them. Adults pretended not to see them at all. When a man finally went to investigate, he returned pale and shaking, refusing to say what he had found. He packed his things the next morning and left the hollow for good. The girl started speaking to people who were dead, not metaphorically, not in the way grief makes ghosts of memory. She used their names. She described their injuries. She told a woman exactly where her stillborn child had been buried, in a grave unmarked and never spoken of. She corrected dates on headstones with calm certainty. Each time, the room fell silent, thick with recognition and fear. Her body aged unevenly. At 10, she still looked small, fragile. But her eyes carried something far older. When she stared at someone, it felt like being catalogued, like a thing being sorted and set aside for later use. Her drawings changed. Fewer people. More interiors. Rooms with beds. Rooms with buckets. rooms with dark stains on the floor. One winter evening, screaming tore through the hollow again. It came from the same cabin where the girl had been born. This time, it was not hers. It was her mother's. By the time the neighbors forced their way inside, the floor was slick, the air thick with the same sweet rot that some of them remembered from years earlier. The girl stood in the corner, perfectly still, watching as blood pooled around her mother's legs. No one asked what had happened. No one wanted the answer. As the woman was carried out, barely breathing, someone noticed the girl's hands. They were clean. The truth did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through fragments, through things that had always been known but never assembled into a single shape. In the days after the mother was taken away, women gathered in one another's kitchens, speaking in half-sentences, stopping when footsteps approached. Men drank more than usual and avoided each other's eyes. The pastor locked the church and did not reopen it for weeks. Someone finally went to the county clerk's office. The records were thin, brittle, and incomplete, but they were enough. Marriage licenses where the same surnames appeared again and again. Birth certificates that listed fathers who were also uncles. Death notices that aligned too neatly with certain unions. When the family trees were sketched out on paper, they did not branch. They folded inward, looping back on themselves until the lines became impossible to separate. The girl's mother had married her second cousin. That much everyone already knew. What they had not spoken aloud was that her own parents were first cousins, and that her grandmother had been born of a brother and sister whose relationship had never been recorded, only buried. By the time the girl was conceived, her blood carried the weight of generations, collapsed into one narrow channel, traits reinforcing traits, damage layered upon damage. The child was not an anomaly. She was an inevitability. A visiting nurse, brought in under the pretense of checking on the injured mother, confirmed what the hollow had refused to name: developmental abnormalities, neurological irregularities, the kind that did not appear from chance alone. When she asked for a family history, the room went quiet. When she pressed further, she was asked to leave. It was the girl herself who spoke the most clearly. One evening, as relatives argued in low voices, she looked up from the floor and said, with simple precision, that her father was also her mother's cousin, and that her grandfather had been both brother and husband to the same woman. She said it the way a child might recite a lesson, not accusing, not confused, certain. No one corrected her. That was when the fear turned outward. If the girl was the product of this folding, then she was also proof of it. Living evidence of what the hollow had become. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was a punishment sent to expose their sins. A few, in moments of honesty, said she was just the end result of too much closeness for too long. The house where she lived became a focus of that fear. People claimed the walls breathed at night, that shadows moved against the grain of the light, that the girl could be heard talking long after she should have been asleep, her voice overlapping itself, as if answering someone who spoke from inside her own chest. What had once been whispered was now understood. The hollow had created something it could not contain. Understanding did not bring relief. It brought panic. Once the truth settled in, the hollow reacted the only way it knew how, by trying to erase the evidence. Men gathered after dark with kerosene cans and axes. Dogs were shot where they lay, not for what they had done, but for what they might have seen. Chickens were slaughtered and buried. Goats disappeared into the woods and never came back. The land itself seemed to be put on trial. The cabin was the final target. They came just before dawn. When courage is thinnest and resolve feels borrowed, no one knocked. The door was kicked in, wood splintering along a grain already weakened by age. The girl stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the cold floor, watching as flames were fed along the walls. She did not cry. She did not run. Someone grabbed her by the arm and pulled her outside as smoke filled the ceiling and embers rained down like insects. As the fire took hold, women brought boxes of papers, birth records, family Bibles, handwritten genealogies, and threw them into the blaze. Pages curled and blackened, ink dissolving into ash. Names vanished. Lines of descent disappeared in smoke. What could not be burned was buried, dumped into the creek, or smashed beyond recognition. The church bell rang once, then stopped. The pastor did not appear. By the time the roof collapsed, there was nothing left to save. The cabin that had held so many beginnings and endings fell inward, swallowing its own history. The hollow stood in a wide circle, faces lit by fire, united not by grief, but by a shared determination to forget. The girl watched it all in silence. After that night, she was moved from house to house, never staying long. People fed her, clothed her, but did not meet her eyes. Children were warned not to touch her, not to speak to her alone. At night, wherever she slept, dreams grew heavier. Adults woke with the sense of being watched from inside their own skulls. Within a year, the hollow began to empty. Families left without ceremony, heading down the mountain toward towns where their names might mean less. Houses were boarded up or left to rot. The cemetery received fewer visitors. The pattern that had once been hidden was now impossible to ignore, and distance became the only absolution anyone trusted. The girl did not leave. She was sent away once, placed in a state, run facility hours from the mountains. The records say she stayed 3 weeks. The staff noted severe psychological disturbances, night terrors, and episodes of dissociation. They also noted that other patients refused to sleep near her, claiming she spoke to them through the walls. One nurse resigned abruptly after insisting the girl had described events from the nurse's own childhood that no one else could have known. The girl was returned to the hollow without explanation. By then, the fire, scarred ground where the cabin had stood had grown over with weeds. The mountains closed in again, patient as ever. Whatever the hollow had tried to burn away had not been destroyed. It had only been driven deeper. The hollow might have remained a rumor, a smudge in county memory, if not for a box discovered in 1984 in the basement of a condemned courthouse. It sat behind rusted filing cabinets, unmarked except for a date range and a single surname repeated so many times it looked like an error. Inside were photographs, brittle notebooks, reels of tape wrapped in wax paper, and a hand-drawn map that showed a valley with no official name. The man who found it was not looking for horror. He was a regional genealogist, hired to reconcile missing records for a state health survey. His work dealt in patterns, births, deaths, migrations, and this box was full of absences. Gaps too consistent to be random. Infant deaths clustered along certain lines. Marriages that closed inward. An entire settlement that seemed to vanish without ever being formally dissolved. The tapes were the worst part. They were interviews recorded in the late 1960s and early 1970s, voices strained and wary, speaking to someone who asked careful, methodical questions. A doctor, a social worker, a researcher whose name appeared only once, scribbled on the inside cover of a notebook. The voices spoke of babies born wrong, of girls who smelled of rot before labor ever began, of a child who knew things she should not have known. One tape ended abruptly with shouting and the crackle of fire. The genealogist followed the map. What he found was not entirely abandoned. A few structures still stood, leaning and hollowed out. The ground where the burned cabin had been was visible as a depression, the soil darker there, stubbornly refusing to grow anything taller than weeds. The cemetery lay uphill, crosses fallen, stones half sunk. Dates repeating like an accusation. In one unmarked grave, the earth had been disturbed more than once. County medical archives filled in the rest. Reports never published. Studies quietly shelved. Notes about genetic isolation, about traits reinforcing themselves until damage became destiny. The hollow was referenced obliquely, never named, but always present. An example no one wanted to dwell on for fear of what it implied about neglect, about silence, about complicity. There was one file that did include a name. The girl. Her later records were sparse. No stable address. Brief institutionalizations. A notation in the early 1980s that she had returned to the region, though no one could say exactly where. The last confirmed sighting placed her near the old hollow, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching hikers pass without ever being noticed. The genealogist closed the box and sealed it again. He submitted his findings with careful language, stripped of anything that might sound like accusation or myth. The report was archived. Funding moved elsewhere. But some patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen, and some questions, once raised, do not stay buried. In the years that followed, the hollow resisted closure. Hikers reported the sensation of being followed along the old creek path, footsteps matching theirs until they stopped and listened. Then silence. Hunters found animal bones arranged carefully near the fire, scarred depression where the cabin had once stood, bleached and aligned as if by intention rather than chance. Local deputies dismissed the reports as pranks, though none of them volunteered to patrol the area after dark. The genealogist returned once, alone. He brought copies of the photographs from the box. Faces stared back at him from another era. Women with hollow eyes. Men with the same sloping jaw repeated again and again. Children posed stiffly, their expressions already tired. In one image, partially overexposed, he noticed something he had missed before, a girl standing slightly apart from the others. Barefoot. Watching the camera with an intensity that felt immediate, even decades later. He did not take that photograph with him when he left. Through scattered hospital records and welfare notes, a partial picture emerged. The girl had grown into a woman who lived on the margins, drifting between towns, rarely staying long enough to be remembered clearly. Those who encountered her described the same unsettling qualities. She listened more than she spoke. She knew things she should not have known. She reacted to family names with recognition that bordered on intimacy. One social worker wrote that the woman claimed she was made of too many people. Another noted that she avoided mirrors, covering them when possible. A third documented a recurring phrase spoken during moments of distress. "It's too crowded inside." There were no official records of her death. The hollow itself continued to empty. By the late 1990s, the county listed the area as uninhabited. Roads vanished back into undergrowth. The church collapsed under snow weight. The cemetery remained, though fewer markers were legible each year. Names dissolved. Dates blurred. The pattern persisted even as the evidence eroded. Modern genetic studies would later describe precisely what had happened there. How isolation amplifies recessive traits. How repeated intermarriage collapses diversity until the body begins to fail itself. Charts and percentages replaced faces. Language became clean, clinical, safe. But none of that explained the drawings, or the knowledge, or the way an entire community had chosen fire over exposure. Somewhere between what could be measured and what could not, the truth of the hollow remained suspended. Not supernatural, not entirely natural either. A consequence of human decisions layered so thickly they began to feel like fate. If the woman still lives, she is old now. If she is dead, she is buried under a name that tells you nothing. Either way, the hollow holds what it always has, a record written not in ink, but in blood and bone and silence. And silence, in places like this, is never empty. The last note in the genealogist's files was not an official record. It was written in the margin of a notebook, dated years after the survey ended. A personal observation, never submitted, never archived. He wrote that when families close in on themselves long enough, identity begins to break down. Not socially, biologically, psychologically, roles blur, boundaries soften. The body becomes a meeting place for contradictions it was never meant to hold. Mother and sister, father and uncle, ancestor and child occupying the same blood, the same flesh, the same mind. In the hollow, those contradictions were not abstract. They lived, they breathed, they screamed. The burned cabin site is nearly invisible now. Moss has crept over the blackened soil. Trees lean inward, roots threading through what remains of the foundation stones. If you stand there long enough, you might feel the ground dip slightly beneath your feet, as if something beneath is still settling, or as if it never fully emptied. The cemetery uphill has no fence anymore. Deer pass through freely. Rain smooths the earth over shallow graves. Some markers have fallen face down, names pressed into dirt, unreadable. Others still stand, though the dates tell the same story again and again. Infants, children, young women, loss stacked so tightly it begins to resemble design. No plaque explains it. No sign warns you where you are. And perhaps that is fitting, because what happened in that hollow was not the result of one act, or one generation. It was the slow consequence of isolation mistaken for safety, of blood treated as destiny, of silence passed down like inheritance. By the time the truth demanded acknowledgement, it had already written itself learned into bone. The woman who began this story, the one whose body became a vessel for death before she ever understood why, did not survive to see the hollow emptied. But her suffering did not end when she escaped it. It lingered in records, in studies no one wanted to publish, in a child who carried too many lives inside her and was never taught how to separate them. If that child became a woman who drifted through towns unnamed, knowing things she could not explain, that is not mystery. That is aftermath. Some legacies do not announce themselves with monuments. They whisper. They hide in patterns. They surface years later in the wrong place, at the wrong time, inside someone who never consented to carry them. So ask yourself, quietly, honestly, what would you do if you discovered that the person who gave you life was also bound to you by another name entirely? If your mother was also your sister, if your father was also your uncle, if your body was proof of choices made long before you were born. The hollow offers no answers. It never did. It only shows what happens when families fold in on themselves, when the world outside feels too far away, and when truth is burned instead of faced. Somewhere, beneath those mountains, that truth is still there, waiting.